The work we've done so far on this billet or chunk of steel has given us a piece of steel with about 175 layers of different steel in there. Of course, that is the 1095 high carbon steel and then the 15N20 steel that has some nickel in it. Those are alternating layers in our billet. Our job now is to specifically expose those layers in such a manner as to create a pattern. The holes that I'm drilling in this billet obviously are not going all the way through. What I want to do is drill through about 1/3 of the thickness on each side of this billet. That's going to reveal sort of a strata or layers of that steel, which you can't really see at this point. Steel is not an easy material to work with. Every material has its own quirks and things that you have to know how to do, but steel is one of those that, because of its inherent characteristics that make it good for certain tasks or tools or applications, the very same characteristics can make it rather difficult to work with. And so in the case of our billet here, we had it heated up to some high heats, and anytime you heat some steel up to high carbon steel up to a temperature above around 1425, it begins to change into a phase of steel or a condition known as austenite. And if you let that cool back down slowly, air cooling, still air, you're going to get what's known as pearlite. And pearlite is a pretty tough form of steel. It doesn't make a good blade, but it does have the characteristics that make it difficult to machine or drill. We are going to try to accomplish what's known as spheroidizing. And spheroidizing is a form of annealing where you heat the steel up to a certain temperature. That is going to allow those carbides, that carbon that has formed carbides within the steel, to sort of pull into larger carbides, pull away out of the steel itself in the manner that it is currently, and sort of get those out of our way. That carbon is still going to be in the steel and ready to be put back where it needs to go once we're ready to do that. But right now we need to be able to drill some holes in this steel. As we talked about earlier, we've combined two different types of steel in this blade, this future blade. And that is our high carbon steel and then our other high carbon steel that has some nickel in it. So you might ask yourself the question, is there any advantage to having nickel in steel? Obviously in this case, it's going to help us create a pattern in the finished blade. But the answer to that in general is yes. Nickel makes the steel tougher. And so it's no surprise that a saw blade steel or a sawmill blade is something that needs to be tough in the type of job that it's designed for. And so that's why we would find this kind of alloy component in this steel. We have the ability now to take this steel that's a bit tougher and combine it with another steel that has a bit more carbon, and you can see how the end result can be better than those two steels were originally in this finished blade. So far we have put hours of work into this billet, and now we can finally begin to make something that actually looks like a knife. Now whenever you take material away from the billet by grinding, drilling, whatever, or anytime you forge it, manipulate the steel in any way, you are changing the final product's outcome, the look of the final product on that pattern that you'll see at the end of the whole process here. And so as I'm forging this out, that's going to influence whatever pattern is on the blade on the finished knife. I'm going to start by forging the tang, or the handle of the knife, and that's going to leave the rest of the material for the blade. One of the fun things about Damascus steel is that no two patterns or no two blades are going to be exactly alike. You can recreate a pattern that's very similar, but there's simply no way to exactly duplicate a hand-forged Damascus steel blade. Even if you tried to do everything exactly the same, there's just so many tiny variances here that begin at the very start of when we stacked those pieces of steel together. So you can be assured that when you buy a quality Damascus steel knife, you have the only one like it in the world. Now, while I am forging out the blade on this knife a fair amount and forging in some of the bevel, I'm not going to forge it completely to shape. That extent of forging is going to deform things a little bit more than I want to, so by leaving it sort of a rough shape, then we can grind in the final profile and preserve a little more of the pattern that we put in there so far. One of the reasons that I forged in the bevels somewhat is because, as I mentioned a minute ago, anytime you grind material off, you're changing that pattern. So we have a raindrop pattern, or a modified raindrop pattern here, because of the holes that we drilled in there and then forged flat. But if I then go and grind off those layers of steel that we just worked on, that's going to remove that pattern. So by forging the bevel down a little bit, that's going to give us more leeway when it comes to grinding in the bevel. We don't have to remove as much material and grind through those layers of our pattern. So far, everything we've done in this project has to do with the appearance of the knife, the blade and the shape and the pattern that it's going to be in the finished knife. Now we need to work on what you don't see. So some of the most important components of a good blade or a good knife have to do with what you don't see, and that is the metallurgy of the steel. The first thing we need to do is what's called normalizing. Normalizing is a process that's very important after forging a blade or making a blade. That's going to relieve all of the stress that we've created through the forging process, which has been quite extensive. It's also going to normalize the grain size of the steel, which is very important as well. We want all the steel to be of the same grain size. So we're going to heat this up to 1600 degrees and allow it to air cool. After that, we're going to heat it up to a slightly lower temperature a couple of times, and that's going to further help refine the grain size after we have normalized the blade. Our blade has been normalized, and we've run a couple of grain refinement cycles on it as well. It's now in the best state that we can make it to transform it into the hardened phase of steel known as martensite, which will give us the best blade possible. Before we harden it, I want to grind out the blade shape a little closer to finished dimensions and also grind in most of the bevel. This is going to minimize the amount of grinding that we have to do on a hardened blade, and also make things more uniform, which is a good thing going into the quench. If you have different thicknesses of steel, even small on a very small scale, that can lend to uneven cooling in the quench, which can often cause warping of your blade. We want to heat our blade up to 1475 degrees. This will allow it to transform into austenite, which is the state that it has to be in when we quench it in order to create martensite, which is the state that we want it to be in for our finished blade. We're going to let that soak, as we talked about earlier, for about 10 or 15 minutes. Then we're going to quench it in oil. The type of oil that I'm using to quench this blade is known as Parks 50 or a similar oil. This oil is the best for this particular steel. If we've done everything else properly up to this point, it is in the hardest state possible for this steel, but it's too hard to make a good knife. And the reason is, when it's too hard, it doesn't have the strength that it needs. And I'm not just talking about the blade overall, which is true as well, but at the micro level on that very tiny microscopic edge, it needs to have a level of toughness, because if you think about it, the pressures that are being exerted on that steel per square inch at that microscopic level are tremendous. So it needs to have a level of toughness as to prevent it from crumbling, cracking, or breaking at the microscopic level, which would of course lead to a dull and not very useful edge. So we're going to remove some of the hardness that we have incorporated into the steel, and that's done with, once again, heat. Relax the steel a little bit, bring back some toughness, but retain most of the hardness that's going to give us the good edge holding capability.